Tonight we begin with an economic collapse that Western economists had predicted, Kremlin insiders had feared, and Russian workers had dreaded. A collapse that unfolded not over years, but in weeks. Weeks that wiped out $50 billion in infrastructure value. Weeks that left 700,000 Russian families wondering how they will survive. Weeks that may have finally cracked the foundation of Putin's grip on power. What the Kremlin did today crossed a line that even loyal Russian citizens had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Russian workers did not stay silent. They responded with anger, with protests, and with something Putin fears most of all, public defiance. This is the story of how Russia's railway industry collapsed, and why it might be the beginning of something much larger. 4 months now, there have been whispers, not from official state media, not from Kremlin spokespeople, just whispers, that Russia's railway system was preparing for something catastrophic. Russian railways have been struggling, yes, but they have been strategic in hiding their struggles. Their public statements have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a script. But what set off alarm bells in Western capitals this month was that the rhythm went silent. Economists who monitor Russian state industries know the indicators. The delayed wage payments that get quietly restructured, the maintenance schedules that get pushed back indefinitely to foreign part orders that suddenly get canceled to sudden retirement of senior executives. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet about state industry, it means something is about to get loud. Russian Railways, known formally as RZD, is not just a transportation company. It is the backbone of Russia's entire economy. It moves military equipment to the front lines in Ukraine. It transports coal, oil, and grain across 11 time zones. It employs more people than any other company in Russia. 700,000 workers depend on it. And behind those workers are families, children, entire towns that exist only because the railway passes through them. When Russian railways fails, it does not fail quietly. It fails catastrophically. And tonight, we are watching that failure unfold in real time. Early this week, financial analysts detected what they described as a liquidity crisis of historic proportions, including debt defaults that had not been seen in Russia since the 1998 financial collapse. These are the kinds of failures that state enterprises only experience when they are signaling something very specific. Complete mismanagement, Western sanctions finally taking hold, or systemic corruption so deep that the company can no longer function. Observers did not know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russian Railways was no longer operating as a functional enterprise. And when a company that employs 700,000 people stops functioning, even by small measures, governments pay attention. The numbers are staggering. $50 billion in debt that cannot be serviced. Trains sitting idle because spare parts cannot be imported. Maintenance crews working without pay for months. Entire rail lines being shut down because there is no money to operate them. And perhaps most critically, military supply lines to Ukraine that are now operating at a fraction of their capacity. This is not just an economic story. This is a strategic story. This is a story about how Western sanctions, combined with catastrophic mismanagement and rampant corruption, have finally broken one of Russia's most critical industries. And the 700,000 workers who built their lives around this industry are now paying the price. The response from Russian workers tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was desperate. Worker after worker, in interview after interview, described the Kremlin's handling of this crisis as incompetent, dishonest, and perhaps most importantly, unforgivable, because families were promised stability and given bankruptcy instead. But silence only works if the population stays afraid. Russian workers are no longer afraid. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated we have seen in Putin's Russia. Here is what we know. Within hours of the bankruptcy announcement, workers in at least 12 Russian cities organized protests. These were not the small, quickly suppressed demonstrations we have seen before. These were large gatherings, workers standing with their families, holding signs, demanding answers. They hit Moscow's Kazansky station. They hit St. Petersburg's Moskovsky terminal. They hit Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Vladivostok. In other words, workers targeted the very symbols of Russian railways' former glory. the stations that once represented Soviet achievement and Russian power. This is what made the Kremlin's silence so telling. The regime's first instinct is always suppression, always force, always arrests. But tonight, the police response was muted, almost hesitant, because arresting 700,000 workers is not possible. Arresting their families is not possible. Suppressing an entire class of citizens who have nothing left to lose is not possible. And Putin, for perhaps the first time, is realizing that his tools of control have limits. You cannot threaten someone who has already lost everything. You cannot scare someone whose children are going hungry. You cannot silence someone who no longer believes your lies. Tonight, independent Russian media confirmed that workers launched coordinated actions across multiple railway hubs, including the critical Trans-Siberian corridor that had recently been prioritized for military shipments. Workers walked off the job before the Kremlin could deploy replacement crews. They shut down the Moscow-Vladivostok line. They shut down the northern freight corridors. They shut down maintenance depots that were likely preparing to service military transport vehicles. In other words, workers targeted the logistical infrastructure that keeps Russia's war machine moving, the supply chain that would have kept weapons flowing to Ukraine. This is what made Western analysts take notice. Russian workers' protest was not just about wages. It was strategic. It represented the kind of action that could cripple military operations if left unaddressed. And the Kremlin, understanding that fully, faces an impossible choice. They cannot pay the workers. There is no money. They cannot arrest the workers. There are too many. They cannot replace the workers. These are skilled positions that take years to train. They cannot ignore the workers. The entire economy depends on them. So instead, the Kremlin did what it always does when faced with impossible situations. It lied. State media claimed the protests were small. State media claimed the workers were paid. State media claimed Western propaganda was exaggerating the crisis. But satellite imagery tells a different story. Social media posts tell a different story. And 700,000 workers who have not been paid in months tell a different story. And here is where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that the Kremlin's handling of this crisis was designed to test the loyalty of the Russian working class after years of economic pressure. Putin wanted to see whether workers would accept poverty quietly. But instead, the opposite happened. Workers did not accept it quietly. They organized a response that was so rapid, so coordinated, that even Kremlin insiders noticed. You do not get Putin's attention easily. But today, Russian railway workers did. Economic analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described the Kremlin strategy as extraction, a way to drain state industries of resources while shifting blame to Western sanctions. But workers proved today that they understand exactly who is responsible for their suffering. Their protests were not only large, they were targeted so precisely that signs directly named Putin, directly named corrupt railway executives, and directly blamed the war in Ukraine. That specificity matters because it shows workers are not confused. It shows they are not buying the propaganda. It shows that Russian workers are not passive victims waiting for the state to save them. They are active participants demanding accountability. And that shift from passive to active is exactly what authoritarian regimes fear most. Because once citizens start demanding accountability, they rarely stop. Once they taste collective action, they rarely forget. And once they lose their fear, they rarely find it again. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of this economic collapse. Railway workers carried out work stoppages in over 30 cities, forcing the cancellation of hundreds of freight shipments. Maintenance crews targeted repair facilities that had been prioritized for military equipment in recent months. Train operators across Siberia reportedly refused to move military cargo, citing unpaid wages as justification. This was not just a labor dispute. This was not just an economic protest. This was collective resistance. This was organized defiance. And organized defiance is the one thing Putin has struggled to suppress since the invasion of Ukraine began. For every tool of repression he has deployed, Russian citizens have found ways to resist that complicate his control. Underground networks share information. Encrypted messaging apps coordinate action. Workers protect each other from informants. And slowly, carefully, a culture of resistance is building inside Russia. It is not revolutionary, not yet. It is not organized into political movements, not yet. But it is growing, and the railway collapse may be the catalyst that accelerates that growth. Remember, Putin thought economic pressure would break Western resolve first. He thought Russians would blame sanctions on the West, not on the Kremlin. He thought state propaganda would keep workers loyal indefinitely. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western resolve has strengthened, not weakened. Russian workers are blaming the Kremlin, not the West. And state propaganda is failing to explain why families cannot afford food. History teaches us that authoritarian regimes rarely fall from external pressure alone. They fall when internal legitimacy collapses. They fall when citizens stop believing. They fall when the social contract, stability in exchange for obedience, is broken. Tonight, that contract is breaking. 700,000 workers were promised jobs, security, and dignity. They received bankruptcy, poverty, and lies. And they are responding not with resignation, but with resistance. What makes this moment so dangerous and so unpredictable is that the railway collapse happened at a time when Putin is under pressure from every direction. Military hardliners want escalation in Ukraine. Economic elites want sanctions relief. Ordinary citizens want the war to end. Regional governors want resources for their collapsing local economies. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting an increasingly costly war. And when leaders in that position face sudden crises, they rarely respond rationally. They respond from pressure. They respond from vulnerability. They respond with desperate measures that often make situations worse. We have already seen hints of this desperation. The Kremlin has floated proposals to nationalize failing industries. They have threatened to arrest protest organizers. They have blamed foreign sabotage for economic problems clearly caused by corruption. None of these responses address the fundamental problem. Russia's economy is collapsing under the weight of sanctions, corruption, and war. And 700,000 railway workers are the visible symptom of a much deeper disease. A disease that is spreading to other industries. A disease that is spreading to other regions. A disease that may eventually spread to the military itself. Western official statements, now circulating through diplomatic channels, were designed to signal that the international community is watching closely. State Department officials said plainly that the Kremlin's treatment of workers was inconsistent with basic governance. That is diplomatic language for Russia is failing its own people, and we see it. You do not usually hear that tone from Western capitals unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, something serious is at stake. The stability of a nuclear-armed nation. The welfare of millions of citizens. The trajectory of the war in Ukraine. And the future of Putin's regime itself. All of it is now connected to 700,000 workers who simply want to be paid. Meanwhile, protest leaders addressed crowds in a defiant, emotional statement today. They said, "We built this railway with our hands. We will not let corrupt officials destroy it." They said, "Our families are hungry. Our children are suffering. And the Kremlin tells us to be patient." And they said, "We are done being patient. We are done being silent. We are done being afraid." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from workers who understand just how high the stakes have become. They are risking arrest. They are risking violence. They are risking their futures. And they are doing it anyway, because they have concluded that silence is no longer an option, that obedience is no longer strategy, that resistance is the only path forward. Here is what makes the situation even more concerning. The railway collapse was not isolated. Along with Russian Railways bankruptcy, Aeroflot announced it cannot maintain its aircraft due to parts shortages. Steel producers reported they cannot export due to sanctions. Agricultural companies warned that harvest transport is now compromised. All of this happened within the same month. When multiple critical industries fail simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. It means the economy is not experiencing isolated problems. It means the economy is experiencing systemic failure. And systemic failure does not reverse easily. It does not respond to propaganda. It does not respond to threats. It responds only to fundamental change. change that the Kremlin seems unwilling or unable to make. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin will attempt a massive bailout, using remaining reserve funds. Another is that Putin will try to blame regional governors and sacrifice them politically. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin will escalate the war in Ukraine to distract from domestic failures. But today, Russian workers took that distraction card off the table. They did not blame Ukraine. They did not blame the West. They did not blame sanctions. They blamed the Kremlin directly. What we are watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see whether workers will eventually exhaust themselves and return to obedience. Workers want to show that they will not back down until their demands are met. Western governments want to prevent the crisis from destabilizing the region, and Russian citizens want to prevent their country from collapsing entirely. Each of these actors has different goals. Each has different tools. And each is watching the others carefully, waiting to see who blinks first. Tonight, we have heard from sources who are now monitoring developments inside Russia. They say protests are continuing despite police presence. They say workers are organizing through encrypted channels that the Kremlin cannot easily monitor. And they say the railway collapse is likely part of a broader economic unraveling that will affect other industries in coming months. But Russian workers are not retreating. In fact, they are escalating. Their response today, coordinated, defiant, and fearless, sent a message to Kremlin that workers will not be silent. And it sent a message to the world that Russians themselves may be the greatest threat to Putin's regime. Not missiles, not sanctions, not foreign armies, but 700,000 workers who refuse to accept poverty while oligarchs live in luxury as the weeks go on. We expect more details to emerge about exactly how Russian railways collapsed and who profited from its destruction. But what we do know is that workers' response was timely. It exposed the Kremlin's lies. It demonstrated that fear has limits. And it showed the world that resistance inside Russia is not only possible, it is happening. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he offers genuine concessions, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If he doubles down on repression, workers have already shown they are not easily intimidated. They have shown they are ready to resist. They have shown they are ready to fight for their families. And tonight, for the first time in years, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has tried to ignore for years. You cannot build an empire on the backs of workers and then abandon them. You cannot demand loyalty while delivering poverty. And you cannot silence 700,000 voices forever. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's workers are no longer afraid. Russia's economy is no longer stable. And Russia's future is no longer certain. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.